wonderful group of people who came to study with us, many of them already acting as rabbis in cantors and congregation throughout the Western United States and even some places beyond. And many of them self-educated and had a plethora of knowledge of many, many books. And they had decent Hebrew. But here's one thing I found when they would come to my classes is they had not learned a very basic skill on how to read a holy text in general and the Bible in particular. So I'm going to call this beginner mind. Whenever you come to a holy text, and this will require a little bit of capacity in Hebrew, which is not hard, and that's one thing we'll be presenting on our array of classes is how to read and understand basic Hebrew. That's going to be coming up this summer. We begin with what I was trained to call philology, which is love of words, but it really means is paying attention to specific words. So what do you do in Hebrew? You have to know the root of the word. For example, to learn is lamad. You have to learn the different variations of the word. For example, Talmud, which is learning. Lilamed, to teach. And then you have to know the various grammatical forms. So you start with the meaning of the word as much as it can be captured. Now, here's the problem, that what many people do is when they look at a word, if they're learned, they know what Rashi says, our greatest biblical interpreter, who lived from 1065 and to early in the 1100s. Or they know the Midrash, or they know the Talmud. So many people don't read the word fresh. They read it through a lens of a history of interpretation, which is not a bad thing. But one thing I taught my students to do was go on something like an archaeological dig, which means try to go to the philological meaning in the Bible as well as it can be recovered. And with the books we have out today, that's actually possible. And there are some websites. For example, I think Bible Hub. You can pick a translation, you hover over the word, and you can click, and it goes down to the Brown Driver Briggs Biblical Dictionary. It goes down to a concordance. It's either Bible Gateway or Bible Hub, which one of the two. I used it constantly, especially when I'm working with a language that I don't know. So, for example, when I'm studying New Testament, I go to look down at the range of meanings of Greek words. What a great way for me to learn New Testament, because I can read the Greek letters, but I really don't know the language very well. But with Bible Hub, Bible Gateway, I can go down into the actual etymology of the word. So start with beginner mind. I don't know what this word means. I'm not going to take any theological positions. I'm not going to read it through the lens of tradition. Oh, by the way, I want to share with you. I saw a little debate going on online, and I went to a passage in the New Testament that people were quoting about Jesus's the Virgin Mary birthing Jesus. I was able to go to the New Testament passage under discussion. I went to the website where I could look actually into the actual Greek words used. I looked them up one by one, and I realized the translation had almost nothing to do with the meaning of the actual Greek words, which means the translator translated theologically and put a theological lens on the verse, not sustainable about what the actual Greek said. Now, when I raised this on the website, nobody who knew Greek contested what I had said, and it was a really interesting thing of what it means to read a text through the lens of tradition and what it means to read a text with an attention to actually what the words mean in their basic meaning, and I do believe that words have basic meanings. The next way you have to study is what I would call, and this really disturbed my students, is understanding basic grammar, what we call syntax, which means how groups of words are used to create meaningful units. So sometimes when a student would translate a passage, I would say subject, verb, predicate, adjective, adverb. Now, why do I know how to do that? Because I had a great teacher in 7th grade who taught us how to analyze words in English, which we had to do trees: subject, object, adjective, adverb. And what an amazing introduction to the nature of language as language tries to create meaning. Well, you have to start with the meaning of words, philology, then how words are arranged to create meaning, and then only when that's done, go to what I call the semantics, which means what kind of meaning has been arranged by these words in this sentence, in this order, with these adjectives, these adverbs, and you might actually say to what purpose, what kind of meaning is trying to be created. Now, this is very difficult if your study of, for example, Scripture has only been done in the lens of Rashi or the Midrash or the Talmud. It's as if you can't come to the text with beginner mind. Just 2 steps after that. Then I would ask my students, when we got to the semantic, what kind of meanings are being suggested. I would call it the range of meanings. And this is a term you used. I learned mostly with studying theory of language when I was in college, that properly speaking, there's a difference between what the word means and what I mean. When I say I mean something, I'm using words to communicate something from myself. But when I ask what the word means, I have to distinguish between what I mean and what the word means. And so how do words mean? So one thing we realize is words have a range of meanings. And therefore, when you read a word in its syntactical unit, meaning how you construct a sentence, its semantic dimension, what meaning is being conveyed, what you have to realize is there's a range of meanings with words and therefore in sentences. So when you read a sentence, you realize there's a range of meanings. And again, a problem with reading text theologically or through the tradition is the range of meanings has been decided for you. And to read with beginner mind, you have to realize, you have to ask yourself, what is the range of meanings possible? Now, from that, you can then actually read it what I would call theologically, which means, is it communicating something about the divine? A last thing I want to say right now is to read the sentences as a sense of a literary unit. Take all back to the verses Abigail read this morning, the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verses 13 to 18. As you go through each of the verses from 13 to 18, let's see, I think I have it in front of me very briefly. Do not cheat, do not rob, do not withhold a worker's wage. Don't curse the deaf, place a stumbling block before the blind, revere God. Meaning these are things that are only known to you and God. No one could prove this on the outside, what your intentions were. Do not commit perversion of justice, don't favor the poor or honor the great. With righteousness you shall judge. On and on and on. And the end it says, love your neighbor as yourself. Now we don't know what that means. Those words are just somewhat opaque in Hebrew. You shall love your rea, your neighbor, your kinsfolk, people in your village. Kamocha, that could mean as you want to be loved, or see them as yourself, that they are a subject just as you are a subject. There's many fine interpretations. But one thing you have to realize is that phrase is rather opaque, and I think intentionally opaque. It's not opaque because the writer didn't know how to write. It's opaque because it's poetic. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is, love your neighbor as yourself is the crown of a series of sentences. So then you would read it backwards. Love your neighbor as yourself, whatever that means. Well, how do you do that? Then you go backwards. Then you would say, don't bear a grudge, don't take revenge, surely rebuke your neighbor, don't hate your brother in your heart. So what you realize, if you start at the end and go backwards, what the foregoing is a theory of how to love your neighbor. And that's where you have to read sections of the Bible, for example, as literary units, which answers a very basic question. Why does the beginning of Genesis describe God creating the world in 6 days? Why 6? Because the seventh day is the Sabbath. That's why 6 days. It's not making a statement about the cosmos, about the origins of the universe. That is not on the mind of the author, the poetic author of Genesis chapter 1. What's on their mind is, where does the Sabbath come from? What does a Sabbath mean? So try to imagine when you're reading Genesis 1, that you start with, this author is heading toward a theory of the Sabbath. Let me work backwards. So, when we study scripture with beginner mind, remember, we're ignoring Rashi, we're ignoring the tradition for now. I'm not saying it's not worthwhile studying Rashi. I study Rashi, I study the Talmud, the Midrash, all of those. But I begin with, forget what they say. Let me do my own homework. I want to understand what the words mean, how they're arranged into units, for example, syntax, semantics, what meanings are being created. Is there a theological dimension, a spiritual dimension, an inner life dimension? And then I want to see it as a literary unit. And how does all of this create a literary unit? Remembering that meanings have a range, not a definition. So I'll be teaching a lot more on how to read the Bible, especially with some wonderful websites that can take you right down to a grammatical analysis. You'll have to learn how to read Hebrew, which does not take more than a few days. And the Bible will open up to you, and you will find that you are in charge of how the Bible creates meaning. And then you can study Rashi, Talmud, Midrash, and the tradition. But I think we really have to start with mastering how the Bible makes meaning as students of the Bible. Okay? That's my 10 minutes of Torah for today. I'll put that aside and go on to my larger topic for today, which I jumped into last night, kind of in the middle of things, on this topic, by the way, which is how to study Scripture well. And I was making basically this point, but not as organized as I'm saying today. We want to know what words in the Bible mean. We don't start with the tradition. We start with the Bible and then fold the tradition in. And something that we'll find is we may have read what a word means according to one view of the tradition, but I can almost guarantee you in the Jewish tradition, anything one teacher says a word means, there's going to be a davar acher. There's going to be a different opinion. And that's one of the beautiful things in our tradition, the multiplicity of meanings. The meanings of the Bible are polychromatic, not monochromatic. And therefore, sometimes when you study what a word means by the tradition, the person who's teaching it to you won't say, and by the way, this one disagrees with me. What a way to make a case. I don't think this would fit into Aristotle's rhetoric. If you want to convince somebody, tell them that half the people think you're wrong. That's probably not a good way to start, but that is actually quite Jewish to say, well, here's what the word seems to mean. Here's what one piece of the Midrash says, one piece of part of the law says, and here's what a different one. What we have to do is look at these differing opinions, understand why there's a range of opinions, and come down on one side or the other, but in a non-dogmatic way, as if I am the master of the meaning of the text. When you study Torah from a Jewish perspective, there is a kind of a humility. That's one point I was trying to make last night, but I want to back up and put this into context. When I studied Catholicism, I was very interested in the idea of an order, the Benedictine order, the Jesuit order, what it meant for people to join an order. And Franciscans, I actually met Franciscan monks. And I actually bought the rules, the Benedictine rules of order, for example. I was fascinated with the idea where people could say, well, yes, I'm Catholic, but there's a particular way to be a Catholic. Now, we really don't have that in Judaism where we have orders. Certainly we have Hasidic schools of thought. They're really not taught as a holy order, but you can be a Chabad Hasid. You can become a Bretzlover. Ger Hasidus is not easy to get into, although I think of myself as a Ger Hasid because my guiding light in the Hasidic world is the Sfat Emet, who's by the third Rabbi of Ger, a little town south of Warsaw, who wrote the text called the Sfat Emet, the language of truth. So that is my core place to go when I study Hasidus and the Hasidic understanding of Torah. So when I look at all of this, I ask myself, what is the larger thing? What is the holy order that I might propose? And then I thought about 6 points of the holy order and then fill them in, and people could like it or not like it. So when I thought of my 6 points of the star of the holy order, where would I start? Someone says, I want to join the Holy Order of the United Fellowship of the Six-Pointed Star. Where would I start? I start with moral character. Moral character in the deepest way imaginable. First of all, there is a moral law. In philosophical science, this is called natural law, which means by our human nature, certain things are required of us and certain things are forbidden of us, especially morally. You actually can't do whatever you want. In fact, you should do things you might not want to do. And it's not your opinion. So when people say, but isn't all a matter of opinion? I say, people have any opinion that you want. I mean, we live in a free country. You can have any opinion you want, but not every opinion is right. They say, oh, how imperialistic. I say, I don't think it's imperialistic. I actually think some opinions are closer to the truth and others aren't. Now, I will start by saying I think murdering innocent people intentionally, unnecessarily, is wrong. Okay, so I'll make that as a kind of dogmatic statement of the moral law. Now, so moral character starts with the minimum of the moral law, but interestingly, when you start with moral character, necessarily it will involve words such as righteousness, justice, ethics, harm, and therefore all of these words must be studied. How do we study holy words? We have to study with the light of rationality and reasonability, which means we have to understand words in a rational way for ourselves and to be able to reason about these words with other people. So I think a core part of moral character is the ability to be rational and to be able to reason well, certainly take what one studies as a guide to action, sometimes social action, community action, but sometimes just virtue, managing your own moral character. So to be in the holy order of the six-pointed star, constant development on moral character, including rationality and reasoning, and all the other parts of moral character. I think from a Jewish perspective, one of the most important is Lashon Hara, using language to hurt people, using harsh language. I think this would include, in my mind, criticizing people, speaking to them harshly, misleading people, defaming people, libeling people. That's a very big part of moral character in Judaism. A second part of this holy order would be inner life work. Now, I believe we human beings ought to seek meaning and purpose in our lives. This is Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. Logos comes from the great philosophic tradition of Stoicism. Remember, Stoicism, we think of Stoic being resilient. That's actually not the core teaching of the Stoics. The core teaching of the Stoics was logos, very similar to this idea of natural law. There's a rational principle of the universe which is somewhat equivalent to the mind of God. And so in the Stoic tradition, if you could align yourself with the purpose of the cosmos, you could find purpose in your life. Now, I don't think Frankl would identify himself as a philosophical Stoic. Maybe from a personality perspective, I think he had to be quite Stoic. Here, logotherapy is find meaning and purpose in your life. Now, a misunderstanding of Viktor Frankl would be any meaning or purpose. I don't think he would agree. I think that would be a very shallow, profoundly wrong misunderstanding of Viktor Frankl that any meaning is logos. Here we have to talk about meaning in the term of morality, but more here, spirituality. Let me give you an applied example. There's going to be a big conference at the end of this month in New York on Reform Judaism because they've noticed that some of their products of the Reform movement have become at the forefront of this atrocious attack on Israel. Irrational, unreasonable, hurtful, riling up people toward hate. How could a product of a Reform synagogue, of Reform camps, suddenly join the forces of darkness? How could that happen? Well, one thing from my perspective is they were educated so much in social justice that they took on the social justice movement de jour. Because if the meaning of life is social justice, then you have to look around for the latest cause. So I would not recommend to a person that the meaning of their life is the latest social justice cause, because the cause might be profoundly wrong and immoral. What comes before finding meaning in social justice? I would say being morally centered, being spiritually centered, being centered in rationality and reasoning, knowing how to assess ideas. So if I were to look for a logos, for me, it would be centered in, you might say, my moral center, and from that, know how to conduct my inner life, my interpersonal life, and also my public life. So I think inner work, constant inner work of sorting out authenticity, your spiritual core, spiritual connection with other people, with the divine if you're so inclined, and from that proceed into all the other parts of your life. So I think a holy order requires constant spiritual work and knowing how to do spiritual work. A third part of a holy order, as I was indicating earlier, is the holy order, in my mind, has to have some body of sacred text. So people in the holy order have a common reference as they build a world of meaning. So what is a religion, for example? A religion is some kind of integration of symbols, rituals, sacred stories, how to study sacred stories, a theory of the human condition, a theory of the human capacity for transformation, what the end goals of our humanity is. So if a person says to me, it's all predetermined, life has no meaning, well, that's a different order, and I wouldn't call it a particularly holy one. There are many people who believe that. Life is meaningless, it's all predetermined. Now, in my worst moments, and don't repeat what I'm going to say now, okay? I say to myself, I don't think you're predetermined to say silly things, such as life has no meaning. That's a destructive, silly thing to say, that people have no free choice in how they think or how they behave. So when someone says, well, that's what I believe, I think to myself, I don't think you were predetermined to believe that. I think you chose to believe something that's actually kind of destructive. I go there rarely, but actually in my holy order, the one that I'm conceiving, I think with many others, we're not predetermined. We do have choice. We don't know how to account for it. That has to be an axiom. We don't know how to account for human free choice. We have to take it as an axiom. Person says we have no free choice, which means there is no morality, there is no meaning. We're just programmed. For me, that's a different order of thinking. So therefore, one of the core ideas of study for me is to study these holy ideas and come to some common worldview. So when you think of a holy order, it has to have these variety of things that I think are best expressed what we would call a religion. Another thing I think a holy order has to have, from my perspective, is its practices in space and time. Now, this is something that the Jewish tradition, I think, does very richly. The only other tradition that I know of that takes time as seriously is the Catholic tradition. If you look very deeply into Catholic holidays, they have a richness, a ritual kind of richness, a procedure of spiritual development that I think is similar to that of Judaism. Another thing Catholics have that Judaism doesn't have is cathedrals. So I didn't know this until I learned about it, that cathedrals are actually spiritual journeys. Every step you take in a cathedral is a different step in the spiritual journey. When you walk in, along the walls, what's on the altar, what's under the altar, what's down in the basement, these are all parts of a spiritual understanding of the world. Now, we Jews, for example, have cathedrals in time. As Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote in his book, The Sabbath, he avoided the word cathedral, although that's what he meant. He called it a palace in time, but he meant cathedral, meaning Shabbat is constructed in time as a journey, as a procession. If you look at the liturgy of Shabbat, each service after the next, the liturgy takes you on a journey from the candles of Friday night to the candles of Havdalah. So there's a journey through time on the Sabbath. There's a journey through time with our festivals throughout the year. So I think a holy order has to experience time in a certain way because we live in time. I think a holy order has to also live in space, which also includes the body. One thing that you'll see, of course, in our tradition is the mezuzah on the door. I'm not a mezuzah kisser. Some people, they touch the mezuzah, touch the lips. I don't think it's a bad thing. But I think it's much more important when you look at a mezuzah to internalize what the mezuzah is saying. I mean, it's actually the verses on the mezuzah. Mezuzah means the threshold, but we'll call that little vessel a mezuzah. What do you call the ceremony for putting up a mezuzah? It's called a Chanukat Bayit, like Hanukkah, dedicating the house. So when people say to me, "Hey, Rabbi Finley, can you officiate over hanging the mezuzah?" I say, yes, but first we're going to call it by the right name, Chanukat Bayit. They say, like Hanukkah? I say exactly like Hanukkah. You're dedicating your house to what purpose? And I say, you need to tell me before we actually put the mezuzah on the door. I want you to say, we're dedicating this house to what? And people really reflect. What does my house stand for? It's space. It's my home. It's where I live. But is it dedicated to some purpose? One way to think about this is, for example, a coat of arms. Meaning if you have 4 quadrants, now you can change these every day. The 4 quadrants that govern this castle, this home, this house, what are the values that guide us? And we can switch them out, depending on the day, but they have something to do with civility, respect, love, encouragement. I think toleration for the weakness of others, their toleration for your weaknesses, the common endeavor to help each other grow. There's many things that you might say an ideal place where people live together, where it's in the traditional family or non-traditional family. There are certain, let's say, long-term relationships. There are certain values that should govern the home. So not only do we live in time, but we also live in space. Part of what living in what I'll call space is one's own body. I think holy orders, in my mind, should have eating disciplines. Now, our basic eating discipline, as you know, is kashrut. I'm vegan now, so I automatically keep kosher. But I remember at a very young age saying, well, I'm not going to mix milk and meat anymore. Now, why? Because I wanted to live in the holy order called Judaism, and everywhere I went, and I never ate another cheeseburger. Why? Because I'm in the holy order of the Jews. Now, then I had to figure out what it meant. So first I took on the rule of the order, and what I figured out it meant, it's what we shared with our children, is, well, if milk is a symbol of life, the milking mother mammal, and the meat is the dead animal, we don't mix the milking animal and the dead animal. Now, we can eat dead animals, and we can drink the milk of a milking mammal, but not together. Now, once I really convinced myself of that, actually, the idea of a cheeseburger actually is repugnant to me. I take it so deeply. Now, I'm not saying you can't be a good Jew and have cheeseburgers. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying to myself is, I realized at a young age that if I'm going to be a Jew, I have to join somehow in the eating order, as opposed to eating disorder. And for me, that included no eating treif, like the forbidden foods I don't eat. I didn't eat only kosher, but everywhere I went, whatever I did, certainly in America, I had to think about my minimal kashrut. Now, for some people, it's being vegetarian. For some people, it's only eating healthy in a healthy way. But I think a holy order has to have an eating discipline where the body participates in the holy order. And I would think healthy living in general. Another part of the body with the holy order, and again, I'm reading out from the Jewish tradition, is our talit, is tefillin. By the way, I put tefillin on religiously for 20 or more years. And we have a couple of yeshiva bachers who walk around my neighborhood having people put on tefillin. And every time they saw me, they say, "Hey, you're Rabbi Mordecai, you want to put on tefillin?" I say, "Sure, yeah." And so I realized I just got started putting on my own tefillin. Like, I don't want to do it in my driveway. So I started putting on tefillin again. So if they said to me, "Did you lay tefillin today?" I could say yes. Well, that's why I began putting on tefillin again. I've actually only begun the past 2 weeks. And I'm kind of liking it. So they text me, "Rabbi Mordecai, you put on tefillin today?" I said, "Yes, but come by anyway." So just to get them off my back, I'm putting on tefillin, and wow, I did it for 20 or more years, and it's really, really been beautiful. Now, I might stop again. Talit is something I'm more serious about. I think probably at least several days a week when I do my morning study, I put on my talit. Some days I do, some days I don't, but it's always out. It's always ready. And the last element, if this counts up to 6, is what I'm going to call community. Hence our online Friday, our online Shabbos, my various Zoom classes, our gathering on the holidays. I think to be in the Holy Order, you have to be able to interface with other people in the Holy Order. Now, part of what it means for us to come together as a group, and they have the benefit of our teachers, is ultimately to create small group studies. But the small group study, in my mind, has to be conducted under the guide of the Holy Order. So I'll say a few words about that. Community doesn't mean people coming together and saying anything they want, whatever their opinion is. And that, when I first began teaching Chavarot, and I taught a Torah study Chavarah. I'm fluent in Hebrew, and my Aramaic's good, and someone would give an interpretation of the Bible. I would say, well, that's actually not correct. They say, well, the Bible is what I think it is. That's my opinion. No opinion is better than another. And I thought, well, if I'm going to continue with this group, they have to know that the Bible doesn't mean anything you want. You have to do the Peshat, the philological, syntactic, semantic, and then add your meaning. But your meaning ought to line up with some basics of what the words mean biblically, and then you can build your own opinion, quote the Midrash, quote the Talmud, quote Rashi, but you got to start with the basics. There's a lot of resistance. I mean, many people did not like it and stopped coming. But I said, if you want me to be your teacher, we got to do it this way, because if a person says, in my opinion, it means this, in front of someone who actually has mastered those other things, I said, I'll have to respond, because I don't want anybody walking out of here thinking that that's what the Bible says, when it clearly doesn't say that. And some of the opinions were just completely unjustified, and people sometimes think that if I think it, it's automatically justified, which is not true. So, for example, in the Holy Order that I'm imagining, if people come together to study, there's a requirement that there are what I call, and I don't mean to sound elitist and arrogant, they are called authorized interpreters. How do you become an authorized interpreter? Well, you have to study. And you might actually have to get the imprimatur of some more highly authorized interpreter that says you're authorized to lead a study group because you know the values of the Holy Order. You have the basic interpretive skills, the basic linguistic skills. And if someone says something that you know is not right, that you can correct them. If I can just give you a brief example from my early rabbinate, I said this story many times. When I was a junior rabbi at Stephen Weiss Temple, I was number 6, which means the phone calls that the operator did not know to whom to give went my way. So I pick up my phone the day before Rosh Hashanah, and the woman said to me, "Are we allowed to go out clubbing to bars after the Rosh Hashanah Eve service?" I said, "I don't need law against it, but I have no idea why you're asking me this question." She said, "Well, it's New Year." It's New Year's Eve. Got it. It's Jewish New Year's Eve, and you want to know if after Rosh Hashanah services, we're supposed to go out and get drunk. I said, let me just, I got to take a breath here. I didn't see that coming. I said, no, that's actually not what you do on Rosh Hashanah. And the person tried to make a case. Well, why not? What if that's what I want to do? I said, look, you can do it, but it's not Rosh Hashanah. If you go to a Rosh Hashanah service, you don't automatically go out and drink. What you kind of automatically do is go home and contemplate and engage in self-reproof and what you want your life to mean. And person said, well, do I have to do that? I said, kinda. I'm starting to say it. I don't want to sound too bossy. But if you want to observe Rosh Hashanah, that's kind of what you have to do. Now, why do I get to say that? Because I am, quote unquote, an authorized interpreter. How did I get this? Well, I have a smicha certificate, but there are many other ways to be an authorized interpreter. But mainly you might say, there is a hierarchy of knowledge and learning. So we should have community, gatherings of the Holy Order. Now, people in the Holy Order say, okay, we're done with the Holy Order meeting. Now let's go out and party. That's fine with me. But in the Holy Order meeting is conducted in a certain way. And I think the best example of a lay-run holy order is 12-step programs. I've been to many 12-step meetings. I worked at a drug and rehab center where one of the requirements was 12-step meetings. And 12-step meetings have a pretty strict culture.
Hi,
Yes,
Miss Howard. You feel better?
somebody's mic is on. It's actually my last sentence. 12-step is a great example where there is an acculturation and a socialization of what happens at a 12-step meeting. It's pretty much enforced by the lay people. Once the meeting is done, I understand the culture is coffee, hanging out, and pretty much staying in 12-step culture. What you do next is up to you. But when you're in a 12-step meeting and you're in the aftermath of the 12-step meeting, the culture is intact. So I hope I've counted up to 6. If not, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 7. But you have a general sense of what I mean, that if one wants to live a life of holiness, there has to be a strategy. I came up with 6 different points, and I'm just recommending them to you for your consideration. I'll listen to my recording. I'll see if I hit 6. And if I like it enough, I might devote one Shabbos to each one of these 6 points of the holy order of whatever it is that I call it, the holy order of the 6-pointed star. All right, this concludes my teaching for this morning, but I will take a few questions and comments if anybody has them about the usefulness of this idea of the 6 points of the holy order of the 6-pointed star. Helena, yes.